Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to my talk. I'm going to be talking today about taming runaway Silex apps. My name is David Marshall. You can find me on the internet as Dave Development on Twitter, GitHub, and IRC, things like that. I work for childcare.co.uk, which is probably the UK's largest childcare search and reviews website. We introduce parents with babysitters, childminders, and nannies and things. I try and contribute to Silex as much as I can, which usually involves a few bug fixes here and there, commenting on PRs and supporting people. Fabian does most of the development work. But I'm also involved in maintaining Mockery, the testable framework. I quite enjoy doing that. It's kind of cool. So my talk today, or the background for my talk, is basically what I've done at childcare.co.uk over the last 3 years. I inherited quite a legacy code base. Not quite PHP 4, but lots of singletons, lots of global variables, class-oriented style programming, lots of controller scripts, one pair URL with business logic, presentation logic, and application logic all mixed in together. So one of the first things I did was I added Pimple. You heard Fabian mention Pimple, the tiny little dependency injection container yesterday. And I started to introduce a sort of service layer to pull away some of that business logic out into services. But it was still kind of a mess because I still had these controller scripts accessing the services. It was still kind of messy. And then Silex came along. I think I was quite an early adopter. It was an easy choice for me to use because I was already using Pimple. And if you don't know, Silex extends Pimple or uses Pimple. And that started out quite well. Because I was initially just using Silex for any new development work. But then, naturally, I started to want to refactor the old stuff to use Silex, bring it up to sort of modern standards. And I did that, but things started to get a little bit out of hand. Silex doesn't come with any prescribed conventions or structure like a full-stack framework like Symfony does. And as I used it, I didn't actually follow any structure or conventions. I just kept dogpiling, if you like, things on top of one thing on top of another. So this talk is going to be a little bit about the sort of decisions I eventually started to make in order to bring some structure to my app, and some of the options I explored. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of things other people do as well. Silex doesn't use config files like the full-stack framework does. So it's actually really quick to prototype or iterate on these kind of extensions and conventions, and it's really nice. If you haven't used it, it's kind of cool. As I go through the talk, I'll be sort of talking about one of 5 things. I'll be introducing Pimple or Silex. How many people have used Silex or are familiar with it? That's actually quite a few. So that might be a bit slow for some of you, but I'll hopefully get into a few more things later. I'll be talking about some best practices for when using Silex. I'll be talking about some conventions you can introduce. A few of them probably no-brainers if you use the Symfony full stack. Quite a few of them are quite similar to what you'd be seeing there. And I'm going to talk about extending Silex a little bit, so how you can change Silex's behavior to you're actually starting to build your own framework on top of the micro framework. And then I might talk a little bit about performance as well, which is a very subjective topic. I'm by far and away not a performance expert, and what matters for me might not matter for you at all, so don't take anything I say for granted. You always measure these kind of things and make decisions based on your measurements rather than what I say. It's quite a lot of code, so it will be quite technical. Don't listen to me. One of the things about Silex is you make your own decisions, you make your own choices. If anyone was in Chris's talk yesterday about the full-stack framework and how he writes his apps, one of the first things he did after installing or creating a project was delete things. You don't really do that with Silex. There's nothing really to delete. If you deleted anything, you'd pretty much cripple what you'd already got. You may as well start from scratch. So Silex is about making your own choices. So I encourage you to explore and make your own decisions. To start with, I'd talk about Pimple. Silex actually extends Pimple. It's a small dependency injection container for PHP. You use it like this. You assign factory functions to the container using the array access notation, and those factory functions actually get passed the container itself as a parameter when they're executed. So the actual factory function can then call and, well, request other services from the container. It's really simple, it's really quick. You know, this is, you'd be writing XML or YAML in the full stack framework to do this kind of thing. The API for Pimple is really quite narrow, and 90% of the time you're probably only going to be interacting with these three things. The array access is how you get things in and out. So you define services or parameters using the array notation, the square brackets. You get things out using the array notation. And then there's two other things that you're going to be using quite a lot. The share method allows you to, it actually wraps that factory function that you've given it in another function that will cache the results of the factory. So every time you ask the container for service A, if it is a shared service, you will always get the same instance back. If you don't use the share method and you just give it a factory function, you will get a new one every time. And the other method you use quite a lot is extend. This is used to actually manipulate an existing definition. So it actually, again, this will actually wrap the original factory function, passing you the result of that function. So you can call setters on it to add extra options, or you can actually replace the whole service if you like. And this is how you might go about changing the behavior of Silex, by replacing services. So one of the best practices I like to do with Twig is to namespace everything. If you're using the full stack framework, you're probably doing this anyway with your inner dependency injection container. It's a real simple thing, but it's a good habit. And you should extend it to your own applications, so anything in your app, not necessarily things like Twig, but your own services, you should be namespacing them. And then onto a serious, like one of the biggest topics for Pimple is laziness. And the whole point of putting these functions in the container is that you don't create these things up front. They're in there ready to be created when you want them. And part of that is for performance, but there's another sort of big reason, and it's one of the most common problems that we see trying to support people using Silex. Well, it's Pimple, but through Silex. And it's a really difficult problem to track down, and I'm going to show you with an example. So the first thing is we're going to define a user repository. It's fairly simple. And then we're going to define a user service which depends on the repository, which is all fine. That's a normal usage of Pimple. And then somewhere further down the execution, somebody decides that they want to set a particular option on that service. They want to set debug to true in this case. And what they're actually doing is pulling the user service out of the container so they can set that option. But then further down the execution, somebody else maybe decides they want to do this. The user repository is a bit slow, so they want to wrap it in a caching implementation of the repository. But because the user service is a shared service, as you can see if I go back there. Yeah, it's a shared service, so every time you ask for the user service from the container, you get the same instance. It already has a reference to the uncached version of the repository. Now, in this particular example, this is going to fail silently because the user service will always be hitting the database directly rather than using the cache. So you might not notice straight away. But in other examples, it might fail destructively. Perhaps if you're trying to add an extension to Twig or something like that, and then you try and use that extension. If Twig's being pulled out of the container before that happens, before adding that extension happens, the extension won't be available, and you won't know why. And it's kind of hard to track down because you can sometimes get 2 or 3 levels deep of dependencies, and we see it quite a lot. And the way to avoid it is, I like to think of Pimple having a theoretical life cycle. It's not enforced, and it requires discipline for you to follow. And there's 3 main stages. The first stage, we call it compile time, but of course this happens all at runtime. And the first stage is defining services. And the only rule is, do not access any services until all services have been registered. And again, this is like, with the full stack framework, you'd be doing this in XML or YAML, so you can't access services. The next stage is again compile time, and it's extending services. Again, and one rule, do not access any services until all services have been extended as required. Again, this is like XML and YAML in the full stack framework, but also compiler passes a little bit as well. The ordering matters as well. You can't extend a service until it already exists in Pimple. You could probably do setter injection and things with the configuration files in the full stack container because of the way it loads them in, mashes them all together. But you can't do that with Pimple. Finally, there's the runtime, and this is accessing services. But the rules aren't over just because you're using it, because once you've started using it, you can't redefine anything. You don't want to be changing anything that's actually already been pulled out and is being used in other parts of the system. And in Pimple 2, which Fabian mentioned yesterday, it's not stable yet, it's not tagged or anything. But once you pull a service out of the container, it's actually going to be frozen. And if you try and change it by extending it or replacing it, Pimple will actually throw an exception. I'm not 100% sure if it gets around the problem I just described, and I think that depends on the extend implementation, but it should address a lot of the problems that we have. So moving on, we'll talk about a little bit of performance with Pimple. Now this is really negligible, I think, most of the time, but something that, it happens on every request, so it bothers me. The laziness helps a lot. We're not getting anything out of the container until we need it. But for Pimple, the container is recompiled for every single PHP request. Now, does everyone here use the full stack framework? Yeah, roughly. I mean, if you use the full stack framework, you're probably used to seeing that command. And that's because the full stack framework actually caches the container for you, caches all the service definitions, and dumps them out to a PHP class. And that class simply needs including on every request. There's no real way for Pimple to do that. For every request with Pimple, you have to create the factory functions, quite often wrap that factory function in another function by calling the share method, and offset set against the container. And this kind of thing can actually start to add up. In Pimple 2, as Fabian mentioned yesterday, there's major performance improvements. But there's one thing I've started doing that I realized that it's quite simple, but it can help a little bit. And not everything has to be defined as a service. Just pull them out when you need them. This is some old code of mine that I realized. I looked at it, and this is for a tiny little portion of the application. The words, names are changed a little bit to make them fit on the screen, but I was instantiating, adding a repository service for the service to use, to depend on. But that repository service was never actually used anywhere else. And not only do I have to set it and define it for every request, but then when it actually gets used, you have to get it out as well. So I just moved it to inline instantiation. I think you do this with the full stack framework by calling it a private service or something. But it's just a little thing that it actually aids readability anyway and can help save you a few operations on every request. So moving on to how you can sort of change Pimple a little bit. I don't do this. I sort of implemented it once and found I just didn't really want to use it after I'd done it. But it's a good example of how quickly you can extend Pimple and change the way it behaves. And it's quite popular in other DI containers, I think. And I'm pretty sure Chris mentioned it. There's some bundle for the full stack framework that you can do this. And that's to auto-wire dependencies. It's about 50 lines of code. You can do this with Pimple, but there's no caching there, which you probably want. And it would allow you to do things like this. Assuming you have an authentication service that requires a repository, you've type hinted so in the constructor. You can then tell the container that if something needs a user repository, give it this service. And then when you're defining the user service, you just say to the container, this is what I want. You work out how to get its dependencies. And you can do the same as what Chris did. So it can work on the parameter names. So in this case, if you just define a service called user repo, and it'd work on that. Or you can even define a fully qualified class name in the container as the key, and it'd work on that as well. And it's kind of cool. So moving on to Silex, the meat of the talk. Silex is a micro framework for PHP based on the Symfony2 components. There's obligatory hello world, create an application. We mount a controller, in this case an anonymous function, against a pattern with the get HTTP method, and we run the application. That's really it. It's very simple. This is from the website. It exposes an intuitive and concise API. Now, there's, I wouldn't say controversy, but there's a few people shout about, particularly people from the Slim PHP framework and Aura, those kind of things. They talk about how Silex isn't really a micro framework because of the number of lines of code or the number of dependencies it has. And if you speak to Igor Wiedler, he'd say that he doesn't think things like that. He thinks about Silex as a micro framework because of how narrow the API is and how simple it is to interact with it. And Igor thinks on a typical use of Silex, you're probably only going to interact with maybe 5 to 6 classes from Silex itself. And if you think of it that way, it's a really simple API. There's methods for mounting controllers. There's the 4 main HTTP methods, but you can also use match as well, which will allow you to match on other HTTP methods or several at once with one controller. And then there's a few methods so you can attach listeners to events in the lifecycle of a HTTP request. And the 4 first ones are quite self-explanatory. But the on method is where it sort of starts to grey the lines a little bit, because the on method is a method on Silex application. But you can't really use it, unless you're going to use your own application events, but that'll come later. You can't really use it unless you understand some of the internals of Silex. Now, I mentioned it's based on Symfony2 Components. This is from the documentation again. Silex defines a range of services which can be used to replace. You probably don't want to mess with most of them. And again, this is where it gets a little bit of a grey area. Silex actually exposes all of its internals via the dependency injection container, which is where I think people get this idea of it not being a micro framework, because if you want to go digging around inside, you can find the HTTP kernel from Silex, from Symfony, the routing component from Symfony, the event dispatcher from Symfony. But you do have to go digging, you do have to go looking. If you just want to use it as an application that actually implements the HTTP kernel interface as well, that's the only really thing you need to know about. You don't need to know it uses the Symfony components on the inside, unless you want to go looking for them. And you might want to go looking for them to extend functionality, which is what we'll be doing later. So it's kind of cool. The extension points are there, but you don't really need to use them. And I think that's the contention Igor has with people who say it's not a micro framework. So as well as those core components, Silex comes with integration for several other libraries and components, all of which are optional. Basically, you use them with, they're called service providers, and basically all they do is they provide container wiring for those services or those libraries, and sometimes between each other as well, so they integrate with each other. And to register a service provider, so in this case we want to use Twig, we say app register a new Twig service provider, and we can override some of the default config there and then. These are the ones that come bundled with Silex, and I don't think that'll change anytime soon. Any other service providers are out there in the wild, and there's a bunch of them for quite a few popular libraries. I don't think you'd struggle to find service providers for a particular library that you use. So moving on to sort of the best practices with Silex. File structure is quite a basic type thing, so I just wanted to show you how I do it. It's much like the full stack framework. I have 4 main folders, I guess. The app folder, I like to have any PHP code that causes side effects other than defining functions, classes, interfaces in there. So that usually means having some sort of bootstrap file. Some people like to have a separate file that mounts the controllers, but I don't really do that. I usually just have an app file. The app file will do some auto-loading, create a Silex application, set config variables, register services, register routes or controllers, and then it actually returns itself. So it returns the application, so I can include it in my front controllers, my CLI scripts. And also something I really like, it's really neat about this, is I use a REPL called I don't even know how I'm supposed to pronounce it, but Sci shell, I guess. And I can just point the REPL at that app file, and that gives me access to the container in the REPL, and I can do things as I wish. It's good for admin tasks or a bit of prototyping, testing, things like that. Moving on to the web folder, really basic assets like pictures, images, JavaScript, and a front controller. Some people do the whole dev control, front controller thing. I've never really done it. I guess it's a Symfony thing. Source folder, this is where your actual code goes, the application code. Again, I'm probably preaching to the choir about this. You probably all do that anyway. But one thing I do is try and keep any code that relates to framework stuff separate from the main code. So it's easy to get started writing service definitions and registering them in that app.php file, but before long it gets unmanageable. And I like to put things in my own service provider, and I'd usually start out with one global service provider for the application. Further on you might want to split things up, but the service provider interface is really basic. You get given the opportunity to register things. In the register method, you want to be registering parameters, preferably defaults as well, so people can override them. You want to be registering services, and you want to be extending services, but you definitely don't want to be accessing services. And this goes back to that life cycle in Pimple. The register part of the control of a service provider is all about that compile time stuff, no runtime stuff. And you definitely don't want to do anything else, especially outside the scope of Pimple. In Silex 2, which is kind of experimental at the minute, this interface has been changed slightly. So instead of getting past an application to the register method, you're actually going to get a type hint of Pimple. So you shouldn't be able to call methods on Silex itself. So you shouldn't be able to mount routes, for example, in the register method. The other method on a service provider interface is called boot. And this is for doing things just before handling a request. And it's usually adding event listeners, but you can also add routes there. If you're bundling some sort of library, like the Symfony security component registers a route. I can't remember what for, I assume for logout or something like that. But also the Symfony web profile service provider for Silex registers the controllers it needs to show you the information and things. Going forward, Silex 2, it's probably about the only thing you're going to be doing in boot, because the event listeners will actually have their own interface. So you can add event listeners in that interface or in that kind of provider. It's generally acceptable to access services here, but I try not to because it is going to get run on every single request. If you can do something in a lazy fashion, do it. So moving that boot method away from the service providers onto its own interface is going to happen in Silex 2, which is, it sounds quite insignificant, but the one nice thing it does is it opens up those service providers themselves to only be dependent on Pimple. So they're not dependent on Silex anymore. So other projects that use Pimple, and there's actually a command line version of Silex called Silex, I guess, it's a C instead of an S. And it would mean that we'll be able to share the service providers between Silex and Silex, which a lot of people have been shouting for a long time, so that's kind of cool. So, similar to service providers, we can have controller providers, and these are specifically for registering controllers. And you could compare these to your routing.yaml or XML, whatever you do in the full stack framework. And again, having one controller provider for your whole application to get started is good, but later on you might want to split them up. Really simple interface, connect, and get past the application. And that Silex expects you to return a controller collection. The easiest way to create one of those is to use the controllers factory service on application. You then mount your controllers just like the hello world, and then you return that controller collection. And as far as actually using that controller provider in main, you need to mount it. You can mount it on a prefix. I haven't in this example, but you can mount it under API, admin, whatever you need to. I think it's there to promote reusability, but it's not something I use. So if you're like me, and you probably are, you tend to package your code together in cohesive units, any code or features that are related together, you put together. You'd call them bundles in Symfony world. I tend to call them modules. I have them. I don't know why. If you're doing so, you may want to move your Silex configuration, so your services and your controllers, to live with the same code that they interact with. And all I'd say about that is just pick a convention and stick to it. So perhaps if you have a user, bundle, package, whatever you want to call it, then have a service controller called service provider called service provider, have a controller provider called controller provider, and then in main you know where to look for and you just mount those and register those as you go. Another option is to have maybe just one provider that does both. It's both a controller provider and a service provider. This keeps things nicely in one file and it's easy to look at. Another option, if you have even further, would be a simple static method or something like that. I won't hang about too long, we'll move on. So having organized our services, organized where our routes are registered, we've actually still got the controllers themselves that are kind of a mess. So childcare.co.uk currently has about 175 routes, and if you had all 175 of those as anonymous functions built up in one controller provider, it's going to get significantly messy. So you need to take some care to organize those. First best practice, I'd say, is name them all, namespace them. In the full stack framework, in your config file, you actually have a root name as the key, I think. Silex doesn't enforce that. And even if you're not using the URL generator, it's still a best practice, because Silex is going to do it anyway. If it hasn't got a name for a root, it'll make one up. It'll do string replace on the pattern that you give it, I think. So you may as well do it. It's really simple. Having declared your root, you bind a name to it. That's all there is to it. And it makes it nice for organizing things, and perhaps later, when you've got a mess of roots, you have some sort of roots script like full stack framework, and it's easy to find what you need. So we've looked at anonymous functions for controls so far. This isn't something I do, but the next logical step would be to move those to named functions. And we don't gain a lot, but if you think about it, we do gain a bit of reusability. In this instance, I could use that welcome function for another route. We probably get the ability to load those routes programmatically. The actual route definition now is just a couple of method calls with a few strings. Those strings could come from a config file. We can't pull an anonymous function from a config file, but we can pull strings. And if we're starting to do things like that, it's starting to sound a little bit more like a proper framework, not just a micro framework. The other benefit is that we can actually test that function in isolation. We can avoid the HTTP layer, something we couldn't do a minute ago. And again, this isn't something I'd do, but bear with me, it moves on to the next step. And the next step is controls as classes, something you should be familiar with. We get the same benefits as the named function, but we actually benefit from auto-loading, so we can auto-load a class, and just a general sort of understanding from developers, where a class lives and whatnot. It's really simple, just move that function onto a class, and then we use a convention, one of the few in Silex, to declare what the class and method call are for that route. It's the same as the full stack framework. If you're using this, there's two ways to do it in the full stack framework. The first part is the fully qualified class name, a double colon, and then the method name. And despite that syntax, Silex will actually, or the HTTP kernel will actually instantiate the class for you. So the method's going to be called as a method on an object, not statically. I guess that gives you some benefit in that you could store state in the controller as you're doing your work. And building on that, we can actually start looking at injecting the container, similar to how things work in Symfony. But Silex doesn't do that. This is something that you'd have to add yourself, and you'd have to extend the framework to do so. Now, the bit I just showed you a minute ago that takes that class name, double colon, method name, and turns it into a class and essentially a callable, is part of the controller resolver. So what we need to do is actually create our own controller resolver. that will look to see if that object that it's created is actually an instance of our own BaseController, and if it is, give it the application with a bit of setter injection. The way we override the controller resolver is by using the extend method on Pimple, and we pass the original resolver to the new one, and we've actually just decorated it at this point. Our base controller would look like this. It has a set application method that allows us to inject the container. It has a simple get method, so we can pull things out of the container. And it has a render method, or various other helpers, that will make things easier for us in our controllers to use these things. Our actual controller would be fairly similar, but instead of pulling things out of the application object that gets passed in the actual method call, it pulls things out of using the functions that we've just declared in our base controller. It uses the get method to get something out of the container, and it also uses the render helper method to render a template. So that's an example of extending Silex to be a little bit more what you're used to, a little bit more like what you're used to. So the next step is controllers as services in the container. I'm a big fan of this, but it did actually split the Symfony community for a while. I think a lot of people weren't keen on it, but I think more people are coming around now. And this involves, well, I should say, this Silex actually ships with this capability, but you have to turn it on. And it's in the form of a service provider. And it actually overrides the controller resolver, much like that previous example I showed you, but it just does it for you. And how it works is you register your controller as a service on the container, passing in the dependencies it needs, and then you bind the root in much the same way, but there's one colon here. And the first part is actually the name of the service on the container, not the class. The class is very similar, but instead of passing the application in via setter injection, you pass in the dependencies it needs in the constructor, and you use them as they are. The nice thing about services, or controllers as services, there's no hidden dependencies, and the controller is actually framework independent, or more framework independent. And writing controllers this way enables things like the Symfony web profiler to be used in both Silex and Symfony, and there's not much reason why it couldn't be used in something like Drupal or Laravel, anything else that uses HTTP, kernel, or foundation, whatever. So moving on to something convention-based. Again, it's not something I do myself, but it's just to show how quickly you can do these kind of things with Silex. Some frameworks, I think it started with Rails having sort of convention-based routing, so if you have a resource, it'll automatically set these routes up for you, so you can put, post, get, delete, etc. I think if you use the full stack framework, you can use the KMP RAD bundle. I don't even know if it's stable yet, but they do this kind of thing. And is it? Kind of stable. There we go. We'll speak to that guy about it. And Laravel has something similar, I think, as well. So you're looking to set up some sort of routes like this. I think I've actually copied this from the RAD bundles wiki. You have a pattern, you have the name of the resource, and several actions, and they all link to a particular method. So to set this kind of thing up in Silex, a simple little function does it for you. You give the function the pattern, the name of the resource, the key for the service controller, or it could be a class name if you wanted to do it that way. And then we just actually iterate over those things and set up those routes. But then it's so simple to actually set them up using that function. And then, this kind of thing would take a significant portion of a bundle in Symfony, I imagine, to do this kind of thing. But Silex, because you're doing things in code, you're configuring in code, it's really easy. So again, moving on. Performance. This kind of thing is getting less negligible now. So Silex doesn't use the full Symfony router. It uses the UrlMatcher, which is a part of the router. And every request, those routes are going to have to be compiled or defined over and over again. If you're using the full stack framework, hang on, well, just a side note, this kind of thing can add up. The more routes you got, I've got 170 odd on my main app. Laravel 4.1 got released, I think it was yesterday or the day before. And they actually removed the Symfony Routing component because it was too slow. Whether they could have done something about it, I don't know. But they used it in a similar way to Silex. So for every request, they had to add these routes over and over again. Now, I took a different approach. Something I did was I realized that part of my app was largely an admin panel that isn't used by virtually every request. So I just decided to conditionally load those routes. And there was about 75 at the time, I think. And there's I did this with an environment variable. There's other ways you could do it. You could use stack PHP and have different kernels against different URL prefixes. But this made actually quite a significant saving for me. I stopped loading 75 routes, and that just took 5 milliseconds off the baseline for my requests, just with 5 or 6 lines of code. And it's again, it's kind of cool that you can just change things like that in Silex. But then again, with the full stack framework, this wouldn't have had any effect. But if you wanted to take it a step further, remember, Silex is really extensible, and it is meant to be built upon yourself. And there's an example, there's a project called Flint. It's described as enhancements to Silex with structure and conventions. And it's by Henrik Bjornskov, one of the stars of Jeopardy last night. And it's actually a really good example of someone taking Silex, building it out the way they like it or the way it suits their project. I'd recommend going and take a look at it on GitHub. One of the things it does, it actually replaces the UrlMatcher with the full router. And how the full router works is it actually compiles your routes into a UrlMatcher and dumps that out to the file system, much like a container is. So that can just be included on every request. It doesn't need to set those routes up again. Now, you do lose some flexibility. You can't use anonymous functions, is that right?
Actually,
you can. Oh, well, you can. So maybe that in the next version, okay. But it's a suitable sacrifice, I think. And it offers the actual repo offers some other things as well, like Pimple controllers, much like one of the examples earlier, some config stuff, some custom error pages, things like that. So it's well worth checking out. The next thing I want to talk about is event listeners. This includes middlewares that you can add with those before and after methods I mentioned earlier, which are essentially hooked into the built-in events of the HTTP kernel. But you can also use it with your own application events. As a best practice, I'd recommend using app-on, which is a shortcut to the event dispatcher. Not only are you hiding away the event dispatcher, but it also does a little bit of magic for you in that it lazily adds your event listeners if the dispatcher hasn't been instantiated yet, which can help avoid some of the problems with the Pimple lifecycle I mentioned earlier. And the actual listeners themselves are just like controllers. Anonymous functions are good, but services are better. The problem with using services, though, is that you don't want to pull those services from the container just so you can add them as a listener to the event dispatcher. And in Silex, unlike the full stack framework, the event dispatcher isn't aware of the dependency injection container. So if you wanted to do it lazily, you need to do something like this. You need to create a higher order function that will return a function that will pull your service out of the container and then call a method on it. It's just a little bit messy, I appreciate, but at the same time, it's 5 or 6 lines of code that could make your application a bit more performant. However, in Silex 1.2, which is not yet stable, this is made easier because you can actually pass the same convention you do for controllers as services to the app-on method to attach services to event listeners, which is kind of cool. But it's worth noting that Silex is actually doing the magic for you here. The event dispatcher still doesn't know about the container. If you want the event dispatcher to know about the container, I do have a little library on GitHub And this is particularly useful if you want to use the event subscriber interface. There's a little bit of an example here. Again, we override the built-in dispatcher using Pimple's extend. And then you can actually call the add subscriber service method, which is, again, the same as I think it's container-aware event dispatcher in the full stack framework. And again, it just helps you. The event subscriber thing is a decent way of organizing your listeners rather than adding them individually in main or whatever you're doing. So one of my favorite ways of using event listening is I like using view renderers. I'm not sure if people do this with the full stack framework, but with the controllers, you're generally required to return a HTTP Foundation response object. But Silex ships with a listener that will listen for what you return from a controller, and if it's a string, it will change that. It will wrap that string in a response object and pass that through the rest of the cycle. And it's quite easy to take advantage of this and to do your own kind of thing with it. So as an example, in this controller, I'm no longer returning a response or a string. I'm actually just returning an array, an associative array. And you could call it a view or a view context. This is usually the kind of thing you'd pass to Twig to be rendered. And then when I define the route, I'm going to define a little bit of metadata on the route. I'm going to say the template I want you to use is user.html.twig. And then in a listener that listens for the right kernel event, it'll see what the controller has returned. If it's not an array, we'll return early and let another listener deal with it. But if it is, we'll use that array, render that template that we set on the route with Twig, and set that and create a HTTP response to send through the rest of the lifecycle. That's kind of cool. One thing about the controller is it doesn't know about Twig anymore, which I kind of like. And if it doesn't know about Twig anymore, we might be able to do other things with that controller. Maybe something like serializing it to JSON or XML based on some content negotiation. Or another thing I like the possibility of doing is changing that event listener a little bit to make it even more convention-based. So rather than setting a template, setting some metadata on the route, we could do it based on another convention. Now, if we combine this, for example, with those RAD resource controllers with routes we mentioned earlier, we could do it based on the route name and use the route name of the current request to form the template name and render the template. Not really something to do, but I like how quick and easy it is to be able to do this with Silex. And that's about it. In summary, just because Silex doesn't come with any conventions or structure doesn't mean you shouldn't use any. Just means you've got to make those decisions on your own. Pimple does require care, and the ordering is important. The more services you have, the more complicated it gets. Namespace things whenever you can, name them whenever you can, keep things lazy. The API of Silex is narrow, but if you go digging around in internals, it is quite big. It's a big thing, it's not small. And Silex does have to do quite a bit of work on every request that other frameworks like Symfony don't have to do. So you should be mindful of that and watch how it grows, because it will grow linearly with your app. So I've got time for some questions. If you don't want to ask them now, catch me on Twitter or an email, or leave some feedback on Joined In. That'd be really appreciated. And also catch me in Silex PHP on Freenode. It's a really good channel. We talk a bit of Silex, but a lot of just code in general. It's really cool. So thank you very much. Are there any questions? There's a guy over here. Should I check one?
Have you some recommendation when we should use Silex and when we should use full stack framework?
So the question was, do I have any recommendations of when you use Silex or when you should use a full stack framework? My recommendation would be whenever you feel like. I haven't actually put a full stack framework app into production. I've started several. I usually get confused configuring FOS user bundle. But But I just like Silex, and I've got used to using it because I use it a lot. And whatever you feel comfortable with. I guess I would recommend if you've got a large team, and maybe if you've got a few junior developers, and you need that structure and that organization off the bat, use the full stack framework. Or perhaps if you're looking to grow the team and you're looking to hire, you can bring somebody in and they'll hit the ground rolling. But if you're bringing in experienced developers, they should be able to work their way around the Silex app pretty quickly and work out what goes where. So again, I just literally, whatever you feel like. Have a play with Silex. If you haven't used it, have a play with it. Get a feel for it, and you might find your next small project, use Silex, might suit. Go on.
Do you use the console with your Silex project?
Do I use the
Do you use the console?
console? The question was, do I use the console component with my Silex projects? Yes, I do. I have a few bin stubs that are just little PHP scripts, but I do use one console app. And what I usually do is just pass in. I use commands, anonymous functions as command, which again, the more you get, the more manageable it gets. But actually, if you want to take a look at Flint again, I think it has a helper for the console application. I like the dialog helpers, those kind of things. And it will inject a Pimple into the console app. So if you can return your Silex app like I do from a file, and then in your console bin stub, you can inject Pimple into the console component, and then you'll be able to use it from all your commands and stuff. So yeah, Pimple, or Silex, really is the full stack framework's baby brother. Igor Wiedler, who's one of the maintainers, he likes to describe it as a user interface to Symfony. Because you can literally use it for anything in Symfony. And also it kind of keeps the full stack framework in line a little bit sometimes, maintaining a little bit of backwards compatibility is kind of cool. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much.